Now from our angles, the next thing obviously we're going to have to build up are going to be our coordinates. And the really cool thing about this is that we actually don't need the angles at all to build the coordinates. All we need to know are that there are these 3 points here in which you have, of course you have these points on your axis, your x and y axis, but you just need to know that there's a point here, and a point here. It doesn't really matter in terms of building the unit circle, how you place them, but that's all we need to know is that there's these 3 intermediate points before each y-axis or x-axis. And so I'm going to jump over to a different unit circle, make this look a bit cleaner, and then I'll meet you guys there. All right, so here's our unit circle. And so before starting off, we're going to be labeling the coordinates of our points here. An important thing to note is that you don't need to pay attention at all to the second, the third, or the fourth quadrant. You only really need to pay attention to the first quadrant, which is the top right of our two-dimensional grid. Remember, the first quadrant is on the top right, the second quadrant is on the top left, the third quadrant is right below that on the bottom left, and then the fourth quadrant is to the right of the third quadrant, which is on the bottom right. And so this is also why the reason our angles are starting from on the yellow in the first quadrant and going around the unit circle in this direction. That's how our angles are going to be labeled. And so just keep that in mind because it sucks to memorize. And so we're just going to only focus on this first quadrant over here. And so there are 2 points, even though I just said it sucks to memorize, there are only 2 points that you actually need to remember. And they're the easiest ones, because of course, what do we say? The unit circle is just a circle of radius 1. And so we know that the x-axis and the y-axis here, on the horizontal and vertical, that these points are going to be, on the x-axis, it's going to be 1 to the right, and then 0 up. On the y-axis right here, it's going to be, the point here is going to be 0 to the right, and then 1 unit up. And so with that, those are the only 2 points that we are going to really actually need to know. And the rest just comes with just a almost algorithmic way of thinking about this. And so with this, in order to build our points, all we're going to need to look at here is going to be our starting point on the first axis and the ending point, or the second point, on the other axis. And so here I'd be starting at 1 and coming across here, following the direction of the unit circle, I'd end up at a 0. This is only looking at the x value, by the way. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to increment by 1/4, because we need to essentially count in some linear fashion, or some way in which we just add or subtract the same value over and over, such that we go from the starting point to our first point, to our second point, to our third point, and then to our ending point here. And so if we want to go from 1 to 0 and it looks like 4 jumps, then that means we're gonna essentially take off a quarter on each jump here. And so for each of these jumps, we're gonna have minus a fourth, pretty much. And so I can go from 1 to, let me change this to black, to 3/4, to 2/4, to 1/4, and then to 0. And we're going to do the same exact thing, going from 0 to 1, in which we're going to go, if we want to go in 4 jumps from 0 to 1, looks like we're going to have to add a fourth. And so from 0, we're going to go 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and then 1. And these are going to be coordinates, but not the exact coordinates. These are going to be this is going to be what we initially get. And if you already see this pattern here, this pattern's going to keep it's going to keep following. You can keep doing this pattern all the way around, but you'll see that that's one way of memorizing it, where then you can say, okay, well, this is -1, 0. And so I'm going from 0 to -1, so I'm going to keep decreasing by a fourth. And this goes from 0 to, my bad, it goes from 1 to 0 in the y value. And so it looks like you're going to be decreasing by 1/4. You can keep following that pattern all the way around, but you're not going to need to. But first, let's focus on the first quadrant, as I mentioned before. And the final step we're going to need to do, pretty simple step, because these points right here, they don't look like the regular points that you might see in the unit circle. What these actually are the actual points squared. And so all we need to do is take the square root of these values. If you really want to just have everything where it's not the exception, you can just apply the square root to your x and y axes as well, or x and y intercepts, my bad, as well. It's really up to you, because of course square root of 0 is just 0, square root of 1 is just 1. So you can do that too. Might as well just put that. And so each of these values, they're now going to equal some new value. Remember, square root of 4 is 2. And then square root of 3, 2. And I'm going to keep filling in these values, and then we'll cut to that once we're done. And so now these are our new values after taking the square root. And now these values look very familiar. Of course, once we go 60 degrees across the unit circle following this line here, we'll see that that ends up with this point here, in which we have this coordinate, which is 1/2 comma square root of 3 over 2. And you can do that for any angle that you like. And so I'm gonna go ahead and make this a bit neater, and then cut to that, and then we'll fill in the rest of the unit circle. All right, perfect. So we filled in the first quadrant over here with our values, or with our coordinates, I should say. And so now, of course, like I said, you can follow in that same pattern of saying, okay, if I want to jump these 4 points here in some linear fashion, where I'm adding the same value until I go from like this starting coordinate to this ending coordinate, what I need to add, blah, blah, blah. Another way you can look at it is just focus on that first quadrant and then use symmetry, because of course a circle is symmetric about both the x and the y axis. And so let's just look at that. So what we can say here is, starting at this at our first point, 1, 0, if we look across the x-axis, then that means jumping from the right side of the x-axis to the left side of the x-axis. Then all that would be doing is just changing the value, or I should say negating the x value. That's all we're doing with a reflection across the y-axis over here. And so you can see we've already had this filled in. We go from 1, 0, a reflection across the y-axis, because this y-axis is our mirror that we're reflecting across. And then we have -1, 0. And we're just going to keep doing that. And so we're going to look at this second point over here. Of course, actually, let's not worry about reflecting it across the x-axis, going from top to bottom. We're just going to focus about the reflecting across the y-axis. And so from here, we're going to have a square root of 3 over 2, comma, half. And reflecting this across here, it's going to relate to this point directly across it. And this is going to be, let me get rid of those markings. All this is going to be is, it's going to be negative square root of 3 over 2, comma, 1/2. And we're going to do the same exact thing, and I'll cut to that once I have that finished. So we have these reflections across here, where all we're doing is we're just negating the x value. And of course, the special case, once you're on once you're on the mirror itself, the reflection is just that same value. And so you can think of it as there is no reflection, or the reflection is the same point, or you can just actually do the reflection and negate 0, and you know that -0 is equal to 0. And so that's perfect. So now from that first quadrant, now we have the first and the second quadrant. So we have the whole upper half. And so now all we need to do is grab that upper half and now reflect it across the x-axis here. And so now we're going to do a reflection across the x-axis. So of course, this horizontal line is our x-axis. And so now it's going to be the same exact procedure, except now we're going from this value in the upper half of the circle, reflecting across to go to a value in the lower half of the circle. And so the x value is going to stay exactly the same, but what's going to happen is we're going to negate the y value. So this value is going to become more negative, and this x value is going to just be the same. And so we're gonna do that, or I'll show this first one here, and then after that I will cut to the finished labeling of these coordinates. So going from here across here, we're going to keep the x value, -√3/2, and then, whoops, make sure putting the negative doesn't confuse you, because now you're going to need to negate the y value. This is going to be for this point right over here. And so yeah, see you once this is done. All right, perfect. So now we've gotten our whole upper half, which we built before, and we've done a reflection across the x-axis, meaning that we've just negated the y values from the values that were being reflected. And so with that, we've built our unit circle now.